He never loved you the way he loved this family. Everything in that will is a mistake, and I will fight it in every court in this state if I have to." My stepmother said that to me 3 days after my father's funeral, standing in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, holding a coffee mug like we were just having a casual conversation about the weather. Her voice was steady, almost bored. I remember thinking how strange it was that a person could say something like that without even looking up. I didn't respond. I set down the glass of water I had been holding and walked outside to my car. I sat there for a long time with the engine off, watching the neighbors' sprinklers run back and forth across the lawn. My father had been dead for 72 hours. His name was Walt Mercer, and for 31 years, he had been the most reliable person in my life. I had no idea, sitting in that driveway, that it would take me almost 2 years to prove what she had done to his estate. And I had no idea that the moment everything fell apart for her would happen in a county probate courtroom on a Thursday morning in October, in front of a judge who had seen every kind of family dishonesty imaginable and still managed to look genuinely surprised by what was in the folder sitting on his desk. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Miles Mercer. I'm 34 years old. I work in commercial real estate as a property auditor, which means I spend most of my days reviewing contracts, lease agreements, and financial disclosures for inconsistencies. I notice when numbers don't match. I notice when signatures appear on documents that were supposedly months apart, but use the same pen pressure. I notice things most people never think to look for. That skill did not save my father's life, but it eventually saved what he tried to leave behind for me. My parents divorced when I was 7. It wasn't dramatic. My mother moved to Portland, my father stayed in Columbus, and I split time between them until I was old enough to make my own schedule. My father was an electrician for 23 years before he started his own contracting business in 2009. It was small, maybe 12 employees at its peak, but he built it himself and he ran it the right way. He paid his workers fairly, he kept clean books, and he never once took a shortcut that could have gotten someone hurt. I watched him build that business from a folding table in the garage, and I knew what it cost him in time and energy and sleep. He met my stepmother when I was 19. Her name is Renata. She was charming in the way people are charming, when they are working very hard at being charming, and I was 19 and not particularly perceptive about that kind of thing. By the time I was 22, they were married. By the time I was 25, I had started noticing small things that made me uncomfortable, but that I could never fully articulate. The way she changed the subject whenever I asked my father about the business finances. The way she intercepted phone calls from his accountant. The way she insisted on being present for every conversation my father and I had about money, property, or the future. My father was not a careless man. He was, however, a trusting one. He believed the best about people, including the people closest to him, sometimes long past the point where that belief was reasonable. He got sick in the spring of the year I turned 32. Pancreatic cancer, which moves fast and doesn't negotiate. He was diagnosed in April. He died in September. 5 months from the day the doctor sat us down in that office, to the day I stood beside his grave and tried to hold it together, while my stepmother accepted condolences from people who had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. He had told me, in one of the clearer conversations we had in his final weeks, that he had updated his will the previous year. He said the business was going to be divided between me and a longtime business partner of his, a man named Phil, who had co-owned the operation for nearly a decade. He said the house would pass to Renata with a life estate, meaning she could live there until she died. But after that, it came to me. He said there was also a brokerage account he had opened in my name years ago, originally meant for college but never touched, that had grown to something significant. He didn't give me exact numbers. That wasn't his way. But he looked me in the eye and he said, "I made sure you'd be all right, Miles, whatever else happens." He died 8 days later. The first sign that something was wrong came at the reading of the will. I had driven up from my apartment in Cincinnati, taken 2 days off work, and sat in a conference room at the estate attorney's office, expecting to hear what my father had described to me. Instead, I heard a will that had been signed 4 months before his death, during a period when he was already sick and already on medication that affected his cognition. The brokerage account left to me had been retitled. The business had been reorganized. The document described a completely different distribution of assets than anything my father had told me about. My stepmother sat across the table looking calm and composed. She was dressed in dark blue. She had brought her own attorney. I didn't say anything in that conference room. I had learned by then that saying something before you understand the full picture rarely helps. I drove back to Cincinnati that night and I did not sleep. Over the next 3 weeks, I made a list of every specific thing my father had told me, and every specific thing the will had said instead. The differences were not subtle. The brokerage account alone represented a discrepancy of roughly $240,000. The business restructuring had effectively reduced my ownership stake from 30% to 8%, and a property my father had mentioned, a small rental house he had purchased as an investment in 2015, did not appear in the estate documents at all. I went back to Columbus on a Saturday and spent the afternoon at the county recorder's office. The rental property had been sold. The deed transfer had been executed 11 months before my father died, during a period when he had been, by all accounts, still reasonably healthy. The sale price was significantly below market value. The buyer was an LLC I didn't recognize. I pulled the LLC registration. It took me about 20 minutes online. The registered agent was a name I didn't know, but the mailing address on file was the house I grew up in. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the recorder's office for a long time. The sky had gone grey. Rain was starting to tap against the windshield. I thought about my father telling me he had made sure I'd be all right. I thought about his face when he said it. He had meant it. He had believed it was true. I drove home and called an estate litigation attorney the following Monday. Her name was Beverly, and she had been practicing in Columbus for over 20 years. I explained everything I had found. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I needed to hear. This is not unusual. It's wrong, but it's not unusual. And it's the kind of thing that leaves paper trails. That conversation changed how I approached the next year of my life. I want to be honest about what that year looked like, because it was not dramatic. There were no confrontations. There were no late-night phone calls where I issued ultimatums. There was no moment where I walked into my stepmother's house and said, "I know what you did." That happens in movies. In real life, you keep your mouth shut, because the moment you tip your hand, documents disappear. What I did instead was work. Every evening after my actual job, I reviewed records. I filed formal document requests through the estate proceedings. I obtained certified copies of every deed transfer, every account statement, every business filing going back 7 years. I had Beverly subpoena financial records that I couldn't access on my own. I hired a forensic accountant named Gerald, who charged a significant hourly rate and was worth every cent of it. He went through the business financials and found a pattern of asset transfers over a 3-year period that formed a clear picture once you laid them out in sequence. My stepmother, to her credit, had been careful. Nothing she had done was glaringly obvious on its own. A property sale at a low price could be explained. An account retitling could be presented as estate planning. A business reorganization could be framed as a legal restructuring. But when you put all of it on a timeline, side by side, with the dates of my father's illness progression and the dates of each transaction, the pattern was impossible to explain away. The hardest part of that year was attending family events. My father had 2 sisters, and both of them had remained close with my stepmother. At Thanksgiving, at my cousin's graduation, at a birthday dinner in the spring, I sat across from Renata and made small talk while knowing exactly what I had found and exactly what was coming. She mistook my politeness for ignorance. She told people I was having a hard time with my grief and that she was worried about me. One of my aunts called me in April to gently suggest that I was perhaps being too hard on Renata, who had also lost a husband. I thanked my aunt for calling. I did not tell her what I knew. The legal proceedings formally began in March, about 17 months after my father's death. By that point, Beverly had organized everything into a case that was, in her words, unusually well documented for a family estate dispute. The forensic accountant had prepared a report. We had witness statements from 2 former business employees who had noticed unusual financial activity in the company's final years. We had a declaration from my father's primary care physician regarding his cognitive state during the period when the final will was signed. And we had something else, something I found completely by accident 9 months into the process, while going through a box of my father's personal papers that I had been storing in my spare bedroom since the week after he died. Inside the box, buried under insurance documents and old tax returns, was a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting. Inside was a 2-page letter, handwritten, dated 14 months before his death. In the letter, he described his concerns about certain financial decisions being made without his full understanding. He wrote that he had spoken to an attorney, that he had attempted to establish protections for his assets, and that he was putting this in writing because he wanted there to be a record. He wrote, near the bottom of the 2nd page, "I don't know if any of this will matter when the time comes. But Miles, if you're reading this after I'm gone and something doesn't feel right, trust yourself. I raised you to pay attention to things. Pay attention." I read that letter at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I didn't cry right away. I sat very still for a while, and then I went to the window and looked out at the street below. And then I cried for probably 40 minutes. Not because I was sad, though I was, but because it confirmed something I had needed confirmed for 17 months, that my father had known, that he had tried, that he had not simply handed everything over without question. He had tried to protect me, and he had been outmaneuvered, and he had still found a way to leave me a message. That letter became part of the case. The probate court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late October. I drove up to Columbus the night before and stayed at a hotel near the courthouse. I didn't sleep much. I had been through everything Beverly had prepared so many times that I could have recited the timeline from memory. But the night before a hearing is not really about preparation. It's about sitting with the possibility that even when you have done everything right, outcomes are not guaranteed. My stepmother arrived at the courthouse with her attorney and 2 of her adult children from her first marriage. She was dressed carefully. She looked confident. She nodded at me in the hallway, in the way people nod when they are performing graciousness. And I nodded back, and we went in and sat on opposite sides of the courtroom. The judge was a woman named the Honourable Sandra Watkins, and she had clearly read the materials in advance because she got right to the point. She looked at Renata's attorney and asked several specific questions about the timeline of the will revision. The attorney gave answers that were technically responsive but vague. Judge Watkins wrote something down. Then she turned to Beverly, who walked through our case methodically. No speeches, no dramatic pauses, just documents, dates and findings, presented in sequence: the forensic accountant's report, the property records, the account transfer history, the physician's declaration, the employee statements, and then the letter. When Beverly submitted the letter into evidence and the judge read it, the room got very quiet. Renata was perfectly still beside her attorney. Her children were in the row behind her, and I watched one of them lean forward and say something quietly to her, and she shook her head slightly without turning around. Judge Watkins set the letter down. She looked at Renata for a long moment. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, "I want to give your attorney an opportunity to address the discrepancy between the asset transfers documented in this filing and the account of your husband's wishes that you provided in your original submission." Renata's attorney stood. He spoke for several minutes. I watched the judge's face while he talked. Her expression did not change, but she was not taking notes, which Beverly had told me was sometimes a sign that a judge has already formed a view and is simply waiting for a party to finish speaking. When he sat down, the judge asked one more question. She asked Renata directly, not her attorney, whether she had been aware of the letter from my father. There was a pause. It was not a long pause, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, but in a quiet courtroom 3 seconds is a long time. "I was not aware of that letter," Renata said. The judge looked at her for another moment. Then she looked down at the materials in front of her and began writing. The outcome did not arrive that day. Probate cases rarely resolve in a single hearing, but over the following 6 weeks, the picture became clear. The judge's written findings were detailed and, in several places, pointed. She determined that the final will had been executed under circumstances that raised significant concerns about undue influence, given the timing relative to my father's illness and cognitive decline. She ordered a full accounting of the estate. She flagged the LLC property transfer for further examination by the county's financial crimes unit. The business stake was renegotiated. The brokerage account, now identified as improperly retitled, was restored to the estate and distributed according to an earlier will that Beverly had located through the original estate attorney's records. The rental property transaction was referred for a separate legal proceeding that I was not directly a party to, but that resulted in, as I understand it, a significant settlement. The final accounting showed that my father's estate had been reduced by approximately $380,000 through a combination of undervalued transactions, transferred assets, and account manipulations over a 3-year period. Not all of it was recoverable. Some of it was simply gone, but a substantial portion was returned through the estate proceedings, and after legal fees, I received what my father had intended me to receive. Renata did not go to prison. I want to be clear about that, because I know some people will want a different ending. The financial crimes referral did not result in criminal charges, in part because the transactions, while improper, had been structured carefully enough to remain in a legal grey area. Her reputation in the family and in my father's professional circle was another matter. Several of my father's longtime friends stopped returning her calls. Phil, my father's business partner, ended a friendship with her that had lasted 15 years. My aunts, when they finally understood the full picture, called me separately, both with the same long silence before speaking that told me they were ashamed they hadn't asked more questions sooner. I don't hold that against them. My stepmother was skilled at controlling the story. She had been doing it for years, and she was good at it. People believed her because she presented herself as someone who deserved to be believed. My father's house sold last spring. Per the life estate provisions, Renata remained there until she chose to leave, which she did about 8 months after the hearing. I didn't attend the sale. I didn't need to. I had already gotten what I needed from that house, which was not the equity. What I got was the box with the letter inside. I keep the letter in my desk drawer. I don't read it often, but sometimes on a bad day at work when something feels impossible or unfair or too complicated to untangle, I'll open the drawer and just look at the envelope. I don't always take it out. Seeing my father's handwriting on the outside is usually enough. He was right that I was raised to pay attention. He spent 31 years teaching me to be careful, to be patient, to look for the thing underneath the thing. He just didn't know he was also teaching me how to find my way back to him after he was gone. I used to think the point of everything I did was justice. I used to lie awake running through the timeline, checking and rechecking whether I had missed anything, whether Beverly had framed something the right way, whether the judge would see what was there. I was so focused on winning that I didn't notice, until it was already over, that I had already gotten the most important thing long before the hearing. My father had left me a letter. He had noticed what was happening, and he had tried to stop it, and when he couldn't stop it, he had made sure to leave me a thread I could follow. That wasn't a legal document. That wasn't recoverable property. That was a man who, even in the middle of his own dying, was still thinking about his son. The money mattered. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. $380,000 is not a small amount, and the portion that was restored made a real difference in my life. But it was never really about the money, and I think I understood that from the beginning, even if I couldn't have articulated it clearly. On the day I sat in the probate court parking lot before the hearing, watching people in suits carry coffee cups through revolving glass doors, it was about the record. It was about making sure that what my father built, what he intended, and what he said could not simply be rewritten by someone with more patience and fewer scruples. He deserved to have his wishes matter. He deserved to have his words counted, and in the end they did. That's the thing about documentation. About paper trails and careful records and the quiet work of building a case when no one is watching. The people who rewrite stories count on the fact that most people won't do the work. They count on grief and exhaustion, and the discomfort of being seen as the difficult one, the one who won't just let it go, the one who is still fighting over something that happened years ago. They are usually right about most people. They were wrong about me. I'm not telling this story because I want sympathy, or because I have anything left to prove. I'm telling it because I know there are people reading this who are sitting with something that doesn't add up. A will that doesn't match what you were told. A family member who got very quiet when certain topics came up. A document that disappeared. An explanation that was a little too smooth. If that's you, pay attention. Take notes. Don't confront anyone before you understand the full picture. Find professionals who don't know the family. Keep every piece of paper. And trust yourself. You're not crazy. You're just paying attention to the right things. My father taught me that, and it turns out in the end it was the most valuable thing he ever gave me.